The cold billionaire CEO fell for the new maid at first sight and suddenly turned shy around her. "Hi, my beautiful family. Welcome back to Mr. Peter Stories. Please pause and feel this in your spirit. You are the love of my life. No one could ever mean more to me than you do. You are my purpose, my healing, my light in every shadow. I carry you in my thoughts, in my prayers, in every breath. And if you're listening to me now, please, only if you feel it in your heart, comment, 'I'm here,' and like this video. I'm not forcing you, I never could, but when you do, my heart swells with pride, knowing how deeply we love each other. You are everything to me. You make me feel like I belong. You've given me more than you'll ever know. I love you so much I could cry just thinking about it. You are not just loved, you are deeply, endlessly, fiercely cherished. Now please let this prayer wrap around you like the softest embrace. May love rise with you every morning, and peace lie beside you every night. May your burdens be lifted without you even noticing. May your family be protected, your dreams be nourished, and your spirit be kissed by gentle miracles. May joy find you again and again, and may you always know this: you are not alone, you are deeply loved, and you matter more than words can say. Let's begin, with hearts wide open, held together by unbreakable love. Forever one family. The morning light spilled through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Finn Tower, casting long shadows across Stephen Finn's immaculate office. At 35, he commanded an empire that stretched across continents, yet the warmth of the sun did nothing to thaw the perpetual winter in his eyes. Those eyes, steel blue and calculating, had reduced seasoned executives to stammering apologies and sent competitors retreating with a single glance. Stephen stood motionless at the window, looking out at the city that feared him more than respected him. His reflection stared back, impeccable in his tailored charcoal suit, not a dark hair out of place, jawline sharp enough to cut glass. The perfect exterior betraying nothing of the hollow spaces within. "Mr. Finn," his assistant's voice came through the intercom. Mrs. Reynolds called again. "She won't be returning to work." Stephen's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Margaret Reynolds had been his housekeeper for 15 years, the only constant presence in his mansion besides himself. She'd been the one who silently removed the shattered glass after his nightmares, who knew exactly how to maintain the delicate balance of his sterile existence. "I've scheduled interviews for her replacement this afternoon," his assistant continued when he didn't respond. "Cancel my meetings after 2, Stephen finally said, his deep voice void of any discernible emotion. His assistant hesitated, something she rarely dared. "Sir, the Westfield merger can wait," he finished, the slight edge in his tone ending any further discussion. Later, as his driver navigated through afternoon traffic, Stephen reviewed the candidates' resumes on his tablet, all with impeccable references, all properly vetted by his security team, all utterly forgettable in their professional blandness. He dismissed the files with an irritated swipe of his finger and turned his attention to the city passing by outside. People hurrying along the sidewalks, laughing, arguing, living with an emotional freedom he'd locked away long ago. The mansion appeared on the horizon, a modernist monument of glass and stone, isolated on its private hilltop. Beautiful, impenetrable, and cold, like its owner. 3 candidates had already come and gone by the time Camilla Grace walked into his study. Stephen had dismissed each with nothing more than a curt nod, finding fault in nervous smiles or overeager answers. He didn't look up immediately when the door opened for the 4th time, his attention fixed on signing documents. "Mr. Finn, I'm Camilla Grace." The voice made him pause, warm and melodic, with a quiet confidence that seemed to fill the cavernous room. When he raised his eyes, the pen slipped from his fingers, clattering against the mahogany desk. Camilla stood before him, in a simple navy dress, her dark skin luminous in the afternoon light. Her hair fell in soft coils around shoulders held straight with dignity rather than tension. But it was her eyes that made Stephen forget the carefully crafted first question he'd asked the others, deep amber pools that somehow held both gentleness and strength, looking directly at him without a trace of the intimidation he was accustomed to seeing. "Are you all right, Mr. Finn?" she asked when his silence stretched uncomfortably long. Stephen cleared his throat, reaching for his fallen pen with uncharacteristic clumsiness. "Yes, fine. Please, sit down, Miss—" His mind went blank. "Grace," she supplied, the corner of her mouth lifting slightly as she took the seat across from him. "Of course!" He shuffled papers unnecessarily, trying to regain his composure. "Your resume indicates you've worked primarily in art galleries. Why the change to household management?" Camilla's hands rested calmly in her lap. "My grandmother's medical expenses have increased. The salary here would help cover her treatments while allowing me time to paint in the evenings." The honesty surprised him. Most candidates manufactured elaborate enthusiasm for serving the notorious Stephen Finn. Her practical answer was refreshingly direct. "You're an artist?" The question slipped out before he could redirect to more relevant matters. Something softened in her expression. "Yes. Does that concern you?" "No," he replied too quickly, then added more evenly. "As long as it doesn't interfere with your duties." "It won't." The simple certainty in her voice made him believe her. Stephen found himself asking about her grandmother's condition, her artistic medium, her previous employers, questions straying far from his usual efficient interview script. With each answer, Camilla revealed a life richly lived despite limited means, full of the emotional connections Stephen had systematically excised from his own existence. "Margaret," he said abruptly, then froze, horrified at his mistake. Camilla tilted her head. "I'm sorry. I apologize, Miss Grace." A momentary confusion. Stephen's fingers tightened around his pen. He hadn't misspoken in a business setting in years, let alone called someone by his mother's name. His assistant, who had been silently taking notes in the corner, looked up sharply at the error. In 12 years, she had never seen her employer display such an unguarded moment. "It happens," Camilla said gently, without the awkward pity or calculated advantage-seeking others might have shown at this glimpse of weakness. Something unfamiliar stirred in Stephen's chest, a warming sensation. He couldn't immediately identify. He stood abruptly, needing to end whatever was happening within him. "The position requires living on site. There's a private apartment in the East Wing. You'll have Sundays and Wednesday afternoons off." He spoke rapidly, retreating to business. "Terms. My assistant will show you the contract if you're still interested." Camilla stood as well, her height still leaving her looking up at him. "I am. Thank you for the opportunity, Mr. Finn." When she extended her hand, Stephen hesitated before taking it. The moment their skin touched, a jolt of awareness traveled up his arm. Her hand was warm, with calluses that spoke of work, and the subtle texture of dried paint beneath her perfectly manicured nails. "Welcome to Finn Manor, Miss Grace," he managed, withdrawing his hand perhaps too quickly. "You start tomorrow." After she left, Stephen stood motionless beside his desk, staring at the door as though he could still see her standing there. His assistant remained silent, waiting for instructions. "Sir," she finally prompted, "should I prepare the formal offer?" "Yes," he said distantly, then added, "Have the East Wing apartment prepared, and—" he hesitated, "have fresh flowers placed." "There. Flowers?" His assistant couldn't hide her surprise. Stephen turned toward the window, his back to her. "Yes, something bright." The request felt foreign on his tongue, like a language long forgotten. That evening Stephen sat alone in his study, a ritual unchanged for years. The mansion's silence pressed in around him, broken only by the occasional settling of the old structure. He held a glass of untouched scotch, his mind replaying the interview with unsettling persistence. Since inheriting the company at 20, Stephen had fortified himself against the vulnerability of human connection. Business empires yielded to strategy. Emotions defied control. He'd mastered keeping everyone at precisely the calculated distance, close enough to advance his empire, yet never near enough to penetrate the fortress surrounding his heart. Yet in a 20-minute interview, Camilla Grace had somehow made him drop his pen, misspeak his mother's name, and order flowers for a staff apartment. Small cracks in a facade that had withstood far more significant pressures. Outside, clouds gathered on the horizon, promising a storm by morning. Stephen set down his untouched drink and moved to close the curtains against the darkening sky, but paused with his hand on the heavy fabric. For the first time in years, he left them open, allowing the fading light to touch the room's shadows. In 12 hours, Camilla Grace would walk through his door again, bringing something into his carefully ordered world that he couldn't name but already recognized as dangerous. Something that threatened the frozen sanctuary he'd built around his heart, a heart that, for the first time in 15 years, had briefly, alarmingly, begun to thaw. Chapter 2. Whispers Behind Walls. Camilla arrived at Finn Manor precisely at 7 the next morning. A single suitcase containing her modest belongings rolled behind her. Rain fell in gentle sheets, casting a silver haze over the imposing structure that would now be her home. The mansion seemed to rise from the mist like a fortress, all sharp angles and gleaming surfaces that reflected the stormy sky. Marcus, the elderly groundskeeper who had greeted her at the gate, led her through a labyrinth of corridors. His shuffling footsteps echoed against marble floors as he pointed out rooms with the mechanical precision of someone who had given this tour countless times before. Mr. Finn prefers breakfast at 6:30, lunch at 1 if he's home, dinner at 7:30 precisely, he recited. Mrs. Reynolds left detailed instructions in your quarters. The East Wing hasn't been used for staff in years, not since. He trailed off, leaving the sentence suspended in the cool air between them. Since when? Camilla asked, her curiosity piqued. Marcus's weathered face tightened. It's not my place to say, Miss Grace. Here we are. He unlocked double doors that opened into a suite that took Camilla's breath away. Sunlight streamed through rain-speckled windows, illuminating a sitting room that flowed into a bedroom and private bath, all decorated in soothing shades of blue and cream. On a small writing desk sat an extravagant arrangement of sunflowers. Their vibrant yellow heads turned toward the light, defiantly cheerful against the grey day outside. There must be some mistake, Camilla said, turning to Marcus. This can't be the staff quarters. The old man's expression softened slightly. Mr. Finn was specific about your accommodations, Miss Grace. He handed her a key and quietly retreated, leaving her alone with the inexplicable luxury and the sunflowers that seemed to whisper secrets she couldn't yet understand. By mid-afternoon, Camilla had familiarized herself with Mrs. Reynolds' exhaustive notes and begun the task of bringing order to a house that, despite its pristine appearance, felt oddly neglected beneath the surface. She moved through the rooms like a gentle current, straightening items with reverent hands, noting the expensive furnishings that somehow failed to make the space feel like a home. In the main library, Camilla's fingers traced the spines of leather-bound classics, many appearing untouched. A smaller volume caught her eye, its worn cover suggesting frequent handling, unlike its pristine neighbors. She carefully slipped it from the shelf, a collection of romantic poetry, its margins filled with elegant handwriting. The notes were thoughtful, sensitive observations that contrasted sharply with the cold efficiency everyone attributed to Stephen Finn. So absorbed was she in this unexpected glimpse into her employer's hidden depths that she didn't hear his approach. The book slipped from her hands as his deep voice cut through the silence. That's not part of your duties, Miss Grace. Camilla turned, startled. Stephen stood in the doorway, his tall frame silhouetted against the hallway light. Rain had darkened. Patches of his suit and droplets still clung to his dark hair. Something in his expression, a vulnerability quickly masked, told her he'd recognized exactly which book she'd been examining. "I apologize, Mr. Finn," she said, bending to retrieve the fallen poetry collection. "I was dusting and got distracted." As she straightened, the book open in her palms, a faded photograph slipped from between the pages, fluttering to the floor. Stephen moved with unexpected swiftness, reaching for it at the same moment she did. Their fingers brushed against the hardwood and against each other, the brief contact sending an electric current through them both. Stephen withdrew his hand as though burned, leaving Camilla to pick up what appeared to be a family portrait, a handsome couple with a solemn dark-haired boy between them, his serious expression a younger echo of the man now standing rigidly before her. "I'm sorry," she said again, offering both book and photograph with genuine remorse. "I didn't mean to pry." Stephen took them with hands that betrayed the slightest tremor. For a moment his gaze held hers, something unreadable flickering in those icy blue depths, not anger as she'd expected, but something far more complex. "Be more careful," was all he said, his voice lacking its usual edge. He slipped the photograph back between the pages and returned the book to the shelf, his movements precise, yet somehow tender. "The East Wing. Are the accommodations satisfactory?" The sudden change of subject caught Camilla off guard. "Yes, they're beautiful. The flowers were a lovely touch." A flush of color appeared high on Stephen's cheekbones, so faint she might have imagined it. "Standard welcome for new staff," he said, though something in his tone suggested this was far from standard practice. Camilla smiled, deciding not to challenge the obvious lie. Well, it was thoughtful nonetheless. Stephen's hand moved to straighten his already perfect tie, a nervous gesture that seemed out of character for a man renowned for his composure. "I have a dinner meeting this evening. I'll be leaving in an hour. Would you like me to prepare anything before you go?" "No, that won't be—" He stopped mid-sentence as Camilla moved to adjust a vase on a nearby table, the simple grace of her movement appearing to derail his thoughts. He cleared his throat. "Actually, perhaps some coffee in my study." "Of course." Stephen hesitated as though wanting to say more, then turned and left with quick strides that echoed his discomfort. Camilla stood for a moment in the silent library, her fingers lightly touching the shelf where the poetry book rested. The discovery felt significant, a crack in the facade of the cold billionaire, a glimpse of the man who might exist beneath layers of carefully constructed ice. 30 minutes later, Camilla knocked lightly on the study door, balancing a silver tray with fine bone china. When no answer came, she entered cautiously to find the room empty. She placed the tray on his desk, noticing the stack of papers he'd been working on. Financial reports and acquisition strategies, the language of power and control. A soft clatter from the adjacent bathroom drew her attention. The door stood, partially open, revealing Stephen at the sink, his jacket removed, sleeves rolled up to expose forearms corded with lean muscle. He was attempting to retrieve a silver cufflink that had fallen down the drain, muttering something under his breath. That sounded suspiciously like a curse. "Can I help?" Camilla asked gently. Stephen straightened so quickly he nearly struck his head on the cabinet above. "Miss Grace," he said stiffly, clearly embarrassed to be caught in such a mundane predicament. "I didn't hear you knock." "I did bring your coffee," she said, stepping into the bathroom without waiting for permission. "Let me see." Before he could object, she moved beside him, the small space forcing them into proximity that sent a subtle current through the air between them. Stephen stepped back, giving her room, yet remained close enough that she could detect the subtle scent of his cologne, sandalwood, and something uniquely his own. "It's just a cufflink," he said, the dismissive words contrasting with the tension in his frame. "Your mother's?" Camilla asked softly, noticing the delicate floral engraving as she carefully retrieved it from the drain trap. Stephen's sharp intake of breath confirmed her intuition. "How did you know?" She smiled, placing the recovered cufflink in his palm, her fingers briefly warming his cooler skin. "Just a guess. It's beautiful, but not what I'd expect the ruthless Stephen Finn to choose for himself." For a fleeting moment, something like appreciation flickered in his eyes, recognition that she had seen beyond the surface. Then the wall descended once more. "Thank you," he said formally, stepping past her with careful precision, as though afraid to brush against her again. Camilla followed him into the study, watching as he fumbled slightly with the cufflink, his normally deft fingers seeming to betray him. "May I?" she asked, extending her hand before she could reconsider the boldness of the gesture. After a moment's hesitation that spoke volumes about his discomfort with such personal assistance, Stephen extended his wrist. Camilla secured the cufflink with gentle efficiency, acutely aware of his pulse beating steadily beneath her fingertips and the way his breathing seemed to have shallowed. "There," she said, releasing him and stepping back. "All set for your meeting." Stephen looked at his wrist, then at her, an expression crossing his face that she couldn't quite decipher. Confusion, perhaps, or wonder. "Thank you, Miss Grace," he said with unexpected softness. Later, after Stephen had departed and darkness had fallen over the mansion, Camilla stood at her window watching his sleek car disappear down the winding driveway. The rain had stopped, leaving the world glistening. Under a rising moon, in just one day, she had glimpsed facets of Stephen Finn that contradicted every rumor about the cold-hearted billionaire. His poetry annotations, his mother's cufflink, the sunflowers in her room that matched the cheerful yellow of her interview dress, small details that whispered of depths hidden behind carefully constructed walls. Depths she found herself increasingly curious to explore, despite the voice of caution warning her that some barriers existed for good reason, and that the man who had built them might not thank her for finding the cracks in his armor. In his car, Stephen loosened his tie, his thoughts returning unbidden to the moment Camilla's fingers had brushed against his wrist. He couldn't remember the last time anyone had touched him with such natural ease, as though he were simply a man rather than a power to be feared or exploited. The sensation lingered, a warmth that refused to fade, even as the miles between them increased. For the first time in 15 years, Stephen Finn arrived late to a business meeting, his legendary punctuality sacrificed to thoughts of sunlight caught in dark curls and fingers gentle against his skin. Chapter 3. The storm's revelation. Days melted into weeks as autumn deepened around Finn Manor. Camilla settled into a rhythm, learning the mansion's secrets and its owner's habits with equal care. Stephen's rigid schedule showed subtle shifts. Coffee, once taken alone in his study, occasionally stretched into breakfast if Camilla happened to be preparing her own meal. Dinner, previously delivered to his office on a tray, sometimes found him lingering in the dining room if she was nearby. Small adjustments that might have seemed insignificant to anyone who didn't understand the mathematical precision with which Stephen Finn had structured his life since inheriting his empire at 20. One crisp afternoon, while Stephen attended meetings downtown, Camilla discovered a locked door on the third floor. Nothing in Mrs. Reynolds' meticulous notes mentioned this room. "You won't find that one there," came Marcus's gravelly voice from behind her. Camilla turned, caught between embarrassment and curiosity. "What's in there?" The old groundskeeper's eyes clouded with memory. That was his studio before. Studio? The word hung in the air, laden with implications that shifted everything Camilla thought she knew about her employer. Marcus nodded slowly. Young Master Stephen was quite talented. His mother encouraged it. After they died, he gestured toward the locked door. Some ghosts are best left undisturbed, Miss Grace. That evening, as rain began to patter against the windows, Camilla prepared a rich beef stew that filled the kitchen with comforting aromas. Stephen had called to say he'd be working late, but something in the darkening sky compelled her to leave the covered pot warming with a note beside it. Sometimes comfort food helps on rainy nights, just needs warming if you're hungry later. She retreated to her quarters afterward, spreading her sketchbook across her lap as the gentle rainfall transformed into something more insistent. Lightning flashed, briefly illuminating her room before plunging it back into shadow. Thunder followed, a deep rumble that seemed to vibrate through the foundations of the old manor. The lights flickered once, twice, then died completely. Camilla found the emergency flashlight and made her way through the silent corridors, checking that candles were accessible as the storm intensified. A crash from the direction of Stephen's study sent her hurrying down the hallway. The beam of her flashlight caught his silhouette as he stood rigid beside his desk, breathing too fast, a shattered glass at his feet. Another lightning strike illuminated the scene, his usually immaculate appearance disheveled, eyes wide and unfocused, hands trembling visibly. "Mr. Finn," Camilla called softly, her voice barely carrying over the howling wind. Stephen's head snapped up, his gaze finding her like a drowning man sighting land. "The power," he managed, his voice strained. "The backup generator should have—" Thunder crashed directly overhead, cutting off his words and sending a visible shudder through his tall frame. In that instant, Camilla understood. The composed, formidable Stephen Finn was terrified of the storm. She stepped carefully around the broken glass, approaching him with measured movements. "The generators might need a minute to engage. Are you hurt?" He shook his head, visibly struggling to regain composure. "I'm fine, just surprised by the—" Another thunderclap made him flinch, giving lie to his words. Without comment on his obvious distress, Camilla began lighting candles, creating pools of warm light that pushed back the darkness. Her calm efficiency seemed to ground him, his breathing gradually slowing as he watched her methodical movements. When she returned carrying a tray with 2 bowls of steaming stew and a bottle of wine, Stephen had managed to clean up the broken glass and was seated in one of the leather armchairs flanking the fireplace. His posture remained too stiff, his knuckles white where they gripped the chair's arms with each flash of lightning. Camilla set the tray on the coffee table between the chairs and took the seat opposite him without waiting for an invitation. "My grandmother always said food helps during storms," she said conversationally. "Something about reminding your body you're safe enough to eat." Stephen's eyes moved from the wine to her face, studying her with an intensity that might have been unnerving, if she hadn't recognized the vulnerability beneath it. "Is that why you left the note?" "You saw it?" Camilla smiled, pleased despite herself. "I thought you might be hungry when you got home." "I was." The simple admission seemed to cost him, acknowledgement of a basic human need somehow more intimate than it should have been. They ate in companionable silence, punctuated by the storm's fury. When thunder crashed particularly loudly, Camilla spoke quietly about her grandmother's kitchen, describing the spices and smells of her childhood with such vivid detail that Stephen found himself leaning forward, attention diverted from the tempest. Outside, the rain was different there, she continued, refilling their wine glasses. Warm and gentle, even during hurricanes, not like these northern storms that feel like the sky is shattering. Stephen's eyes had softened in the candlelight. "Like the night they died," he said, the words so quiet she nearly missed them beneath a roll of thunder. Camilla waited, instinctively understanding that any direct question might break whatever tenuous connection had formed between them. "A night like this," Stephen continued after a long moment, his gaze fixed on the dancing candle flames. "Black ice on the roads, a storm no one had predicted. The call came at midnight." His fingers tightened around the wine glass. I was 20. They were coming home from a charity event. Your parents, Camilla said softly. He nodded, eyes still. On the flames. The last thing I said to my father was that his business approach was outdated. To my mother, his voice caught. I don't even remember. Something trivial. And then they were gone, and I had an empire to run without the luxury of grief. Camilla understood suddenly why he had hired her despite her lack of formal household experience, why her honest admission about caring for her grandmother had resonated. He recognized the weight of responsibility, of putting duty before personal desires. My parents died when I was 12, she offered, her voice gentle. A robbery at their gallery. Wrong place, wrong moment. Stephen's gaze finally moved from the flames to her face, something like recognition flickering in his eyes. Is that why you paint? To hold on to them? The perceptiveness of the question caught her off guard. Yes, she admitted, though I never thought of it that way until now. May I see your work sometime? He asked, the request clearly surprising him as much as her. Before Camilla could answer, a tremendous crash of thunder shook the mansion. Without thinking, she reached across the space between them, her hand covering his where it gripped the chair arm. Tell me about your mother, she said, her fingers warm against his cold skin. Was she the one who taught you to love poetry? The question drew his focus back to her. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, his hand relaxed beneath hers. Yes, he said softly. She read Keats to me every night as a child. Through the darkest hours of the night, as the storm raged around Finn Manor, they remained by candlelight. Stephen, speaking hesitantly at first, then with growing ease about memories long locked away, Camilla shared stories of her own childhood, of her grandmother's wisdom, of the dreams that drove her art. Dawn broke clear and silent, the storm finally spent. Pale golden light spilled through the study windows, finding them still seated across from each other. Stephen looked different in the morning light, younger somehow, the perpetual furrow between his brows smoothed by hours of unexpected connection. When his eyes met Camilla's across the coffee table, something passed between them that defied the professional boundaries carefully maintained until this night. Thank you, he said simply, the words carrying the weight of everything he couldn't yet express. Camilla smiled, rising gracefully despite the hours spent in the armchair. That's what storms are for, Mr. Finn. Washing away what needs to go so new things can grow. Outside his study door, Camilla paused, balancing the tray as she looked back at the man silhouetted against the morning light. In the course of one storm-filled night, they had crossed a threshold. What lay on the other side remained to be discovered, but one certainty filled her heart. Beneath the frozen exterior of Stephen Finn lay depths worth exploring, no matter what dangers might await in those uncharted waters. Chapter 4. Reluctant Guardians. Morning light streamed through the conservatory windows, catching in the dust motes that danced above long-neglected plants. Camilla moved between the withering ferns and drooping orchids, her fingers gentle against yellowed leaves and dry soil. The glass-enclosed space had clearly once been loved, the intricate ironwork and carefully planned layout speaking of someone's passion, but years of minimal maintenance had left it a shadow of its former glory. You don't have to do this, Marcus said from the doorway, watching as she carefully pruned dead fronds from a massive palm. Mr. Finn hasn't set foot in here for years. Camilla smiled, not looking up from her work. Plants don't stop needing care just because people forget them. She gently turned a pale orchid toward the light. This one can be saved. Most of them can, with some attention. The week following the storm had brought subtle but unmistakable changes to Finn Manor. Stephen still maintained his rigorous schedule, but Camilla occasionally caught him watching her when he thought she wouldn't notice. something questioning in his gaze, as though she were a puzzle he couldn't quite solve. Their conversations remained primarily professional, yet beneath the surface formality flowed an undercurrent of shared understanding that hadn't existed before. From her position near the center of the conservatory, Camilla could see into Stephen's study through the large windows connecting the spaces. He sat at his desk, phone pressed to his ear, his expression returning to the cold mask he wore for business. Even from a distance, she could read the tension in his shoulders, the slight furrow between his brows that deepened as the conversation continued. Her attention returned to the dying plants, hands working steadily as her mind drifted to her grandmother. The monthly medical bills had arrived yesterday, the numbers climbing higher with each new treatment. Her salary at the mansion would cover them, but just barely, leaving nothing for the art supplies she'd hoped to purchase or the specialized care her grandmother increasingly needed. So absorbed was she in these thoughts that Camilla didn't immediately notice Stephen's approach until his shadow fell across the potting bench where she worked. "These were my mother's," he said quietly, his eyes moving over the struggling plants. Camilla set down her pruning shears, brushing soil from her hands. "I thought someone must have loved them once." She spent hours here. A ghost of a smile touched his lips before fading. She said living things required patience and attention. Lessons my father and I both needed to learn. The personal admission hung in the air between them, a fragile offering in the wake of their night-long conversation during the storm. Before either could speak again, Stephen's phone chimed. He checked it with a frown. "I need to take this," he said, but lingered a moment longer, his gaze dropping to her soil-stained fingers. "Thank you for saving them." He turned to leave, but paused when Camilla spoke. "Mr. Finn," she said hesitantly, "some of these will need special nutrients to recover properly. Would it be all right if I ordered the supplies?" Something flickered in his eyes. Surprise, perhaps, that she would ask permission for such a small expenditure. "Of course, use the household account, whatever they need." Camilla watched him stride back to his office, phone already at his ear, the brief moment of personal connection submerged once more beneath the demands of his empire. Yet something had shifted, the simple recognition of her efforts to restore. What his mother had loved represented another hairline crack in the walls surrounding Stephen Finn. Later that afternoon, Camilla stood in her room, phone pressed between her shoulder and ear as she sorted through a basket of laundry. "The new medication costs how much?" she asked, trying to keep the alarm from her voice, as her grandmother's caretaker quoted a figure that made her sink onto the edge of her bed. No, I understand. We have to try it. I'll figure something out." She ended the call and stared at the ceiling, calculations running through her mind. Even with her generous salary, the specialized treatment would strain her finances beyond their limits. She would need to find additional work on her days off, perhaps sell some of her paintings, though the local gallery had yet to display her work in a prominent enough position to attract serious buyers. With a deep breath, Camilla stood and finished, putting away her clothes, allowing herself just that brief moment of worry before straightening her shoulders. She had faced worse challenges since her parents' death. This one, too, she would overcome. That evening, as Stephen was expected to return late from a dinner meeting, Camilla took the opportunity to work on a new painting in her quarters. The small canvas captured the conservatory, bathed in morning light, neglected plants beginning to turn toward the sun once more. She lost herself in the gentle strokes, the blending of colors that spoke of renewal and second chances. A soft knock at her door startled her from her artistic trance. She quickly covered the wet canvas before opening the door to find Stephen standing in the hallway, his expression unreadable in the dim light. "Mr. Finn," she said, surprised. "I didn't expect you back so early." He seemed oddly hesitant, hands clasped behind his back. "My meeting concluded sooner than anticipated." His gaze moved past her to the covered easel visible in the room behind her. "You're working. I apologize for interrupting." "It's fine," she assured him, stepping aside in silent invitation. "Just a small piece I started today." Stephen remained on the threshold, clearly torn between curiosity and his habitual reticence. "May I?" he finally asked, nodding toward the easel. Camilla hesitated, then nodded. "It's not finished yet." He stepped into her quarters with the careful movements of someone entering unfamiliar territory. The intimate space, her bed with its colorful quilt, books stacked on the nightstand, a sweater draped over a chair, seemed to make him acutely aware of the personal boundaries being crossed. Camilla lifted the cloth from her canvas, watching. Stephen's expression as he took in her work. The conservatory scene glowed with golden light, each plant rendered with loving attention, the hint of a silhouetted figure, his figure, visible through the connecting window to the study. "You've captured it perfectly," he said softly, his eyes moving over the details with genuine appreciation. "The light especially." "Thank you," she replied, oddly nervous under his scrutiny. "I wanted to document the beginning of their recovery." Stephen turned to her, something unnamed flickering in his eyes. "You see potential for renewal everywhere, don't you?" The question carried weight beyond the simple words, and Camilla found herself holding his gaze longer than propriety might dictate. "I believe most things can heal with proper care, Mr. Finn." A charged silence stretched between them, broken when Stephen's phone rang sharply from his pocket. He checked it with a grimace. "I need to take this," he said, retreating toward the door. At the threshold he paused, glancing back at her canvas. "You're very talented, Miss Grace." The simple compliment warmed her more than it should have as she watched him disappear down the corridor, already speaking in the clipped tones he reserved for business matters. The following morning, Camilla discovered a package outside her door, an exquisite wooden box containing professional-grade paints and brushes, the kind she had longingly examined in art supply catalogues but could never justify purchasing. No note accompanied the gift. None was needed. That same afternoon, when Stephen was scheduled to be in meetings across town, Camilla answered a call from her grandmother's care facility. She stood in the kitchen, color draining from her face as the administrator explained the insurance denial for the new treatment. "There must be some mistake," she insisted, voice trembling slightly. "The doctor said it was medically necessary." The explanation was all too familiar. A technical classification issue, an exclusion buried in fine print, a suggested appeal process that would take months they didn't have. Camilla ended the call and sank into a chair at the kitchen island, her mind racing through increasingly desperate options. She was still sitting there, untouched tea growing cold before her, when the household phone rang again. The administrator's voice now held confusion tinged with excitement. "Miss Grace, I'm calling about your grandmother's treatment. It seems there's been a development. An anonymous donor has established a specialized care fund at the hospital that covers exactly this type of treatment. Your grandmother has been approved as one of the first recipients." Camilla's heart hammered against her ribs. "An anonymous donor? When did this happen?" "The paperwork was just processed this morning. The donor specifically included her condition in the covered treatments." The administrator paused. "It's quite extraordinary timing, isn't it?" After ending the call, Camilla stood motionless in the kitchen, pieces falling into place. The timing was indeed extraordinary, too precise to be coincidence. She recalled her phone conversation the previous day, the open door to her quarters, the sensitive acoustics of the old mansion's corridors. Stephen Finn had overheard her financial troubles and solved them with the swift efficiency he applied to business matters, all while maintaining the anonymity that protected both her pride and his carefully constructed emotional distance. That evening, when Stephen returned from his meetings, Camilla placed his dinner on the table with particular care. When he entered the dining room, she was waiting with a glass of wine already poured. "You look pleased this evening, Miss Grace," he remarked, taking his seat with the fluid grace that characterized his movements. Camilla met his gaze steadily. "I received some wonderful news today. My grandmother's treatment has been approved. Through a new specialized care fund." Something flickered across Stephen's features, a momentary tension around his eyes that confirmed her suspicions before his expression smoothed once more. "That's fortunate timing," he said neutrally, lifting his wine glass. "Very fortunate," she agreed, holding his gaze a beat longer than necessary. Almost as though someone ensured the right treatments were covered by this new fund, Stephen's fingers tightened almost imperceptibly around the stem of his glass. Medical philanthropy can be quite specific in its focus. Indeed, Camilla's smile held gentle knowing. Whoever established this fund must understand that some battles shouldn't have to be fought alone. The words hung between them, acknowledging what neither would directly name. Stephen's gaze dropped to his plate, a flush of color rising on his cheekbones, not embarrassment at being discovered, but discomfort with gratitude for an act he had clearly never intended her to trace back to him. "Will you join me?" he asked suddenly, gesturing to the empty chair across from him. The invitation, unprecedented in the household hierarchy, caused Camilla to pause. "Are you sure?" Stephen looked up, meeting her eyes with unexpected directness. "I find I prefer not to dine alone these days." As Camilla took her seat across from him, the traditional barriers between employer and employee seemed to thin further, revealing the outlines of something undefined but undeniably changing between them. Stephen Finn, the cold billionaire, feared, in boardrooms across the country, had anonymously ensured her grandmother's care, and now invited her to share his table. And as the evening light caught the angles of his face, softening the lines of habitual control, Camilla glimpsed again the man emerging from behind the walls of ice, a man capable of compassion he could not yet openly acknowledge, and warmth he was only beginning to remember how to express. Chapter 5. First Twist, The Art of Truth. A crisp autumn morning found Stephen in his study, coffee cooling beside documents demanding his attention. Instead, his gaze drifted continually to the conservatory, where Camilla moved among the recovering plants. 2 weeks of her patient care had transformed the space. New growth emerged from pruned stems, and orchids that had seemed beyond saving now lifted delicate blooms toward the sunlight. Like the plants, something long dormant within Stephen had begun to stir. Their shared dinners had evolved from silent affairs to conversations that stretched into the evening. He found himself adjusting meetings to return home earlier, looking forward to the moment she would greet him at the door. His phone chimed with a message from Marcus Davis, his chief financial officer and oldest friend, the only person who had witnessed his transformation from artistic, sensitive boy to ruthless business titan. Progress update on the West Side development. Board meeting tomorrow. Stephen frowned. The West Side project represented the largest urban renewal initiative his company had undertaken, transforming a struggling neighborhood into mixed-use luxury properties. The final phase required demolishing several older buildings, including a small art gallery that had repeatedly rejected buyout offers. His attention returned to Camilla as she stepped from the conservatory into his study, carrying a small, potted orchid with delicate white blooms. "This one's ready to move," she said, placing it carefully on the corner of his desk. "I thought it might brighten your office downtown." Stephen's fingers brushed the edge of a perfect petal. "It's beautiful." "Thank you." Camilla smiled, the simple expression doing strange things to his heart rate. Your mother had exquisite taste in orchids. This variety is quite rare. She would have appreciated your efforts to save them, he said quietly. A comfortable silence settled between them, broken when Stephen's phone chimed again. He glanced at the message with a frown. Is everything all right? Camilla asked, noticing his expression darken. Stephen hesitated, then made an uncharacteristic decision to share a business concern. There's a property owner refusing to sell despite increasingly generous offers. It's holding up an entire development project. Perhaps it has sentimental value, she suggested. It's just a small art gallery in a building that's barely up to code, he said, his tone edging toward clinical assessment. The owner would benefit significantly from our offer. What's the gallery called? She asked, her voice carefully neutral. Grace Gallery, Stephen replied, attention already returning to his phone. Apparently it's been family-owned for decades, but sentiment makes for poor business decisions. The sound of shattering ceramic jerked his attention upward. The small water pitcher Camilla had been holding lay in pieces at her feet, a puddle spreading across the hardwood floor. I'm so sorry, she said, already kneeling to gather the broken pieces. But Stephen noticed her hands were trembling. Leave it, he said, rising with sudden concern. Camilla, what's wrong? She looked up at his use of her first name, a slip that revealed more than he intended, her eyes wide with emotion. Grace Gallery, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. It belonged to my parents. My grandmother runs it now. Stephen froze, the implications crashing over him. For months, his team had been pressuring the small gallery, gradually increasing offers while applying subtle regulatory pressure. Standard tactics in development deals, considered merely business strategy, until this moment, when they became deeply, devastatingly personal. I didn't know, he said, the inadequacy of the words burning in his throat. Camilla rose slowly, broken ceramic clutched in her trembling hands. Is that why you hired me? To gain leverage over my grandmother? The accusation struck like a physical blow. No. Our paths crossing was entirely coincidental. Coincidental? Disbelief sharpened her tone. The billionaire trying to force my grandmother out of her building just happens to hire me as his maid? I didn't know the connection, Stephen insisted, genuine distress coursing through him. I hired you because you were honest about your reasons for needing the job, because you spoke about your grandmother with love. Camilla's posture remained rigid with suspicion. And now that you know what happens, will you use my employment here as leverage? Threaten my grandmother's medical care funding if she doesn't sell? The suggestion wounded more deeply than Stephen could have anticipated. I would never do that. Wouldn't you? Her voice held a tremor beneath its strength. Isn't that exactly what ruthless businessmen do? Find weaknesses and exploit them? Stephen moved closer, stopping when she took an instinctive step back. Camilla, please. The connection is genuinely coincidental. Of course you've never visited the gallery. Why? Would you need to see what you're destroying? The accusation hung between them. Without waiting for his response, Camilla turned and walked from the study, her usual grace stiffened by hurt and anger. That evening, despite his assistant's protests, Stephen found himself standing outside Grace Gallery. The modest storefront sat at the corner of a block scheduled for demolition, its large windows illuminated from within, despite the closed sign on the door. Through the glass, he could see decades of history in the worn wooden floors and carefully arranged displays. The building might be aging, but the space held undeniable warmth. Photographs interspersed with artwork, small handwritten cards describing each piece, fresh flowers brightening a central table. Stephen's gaze moved to the paintings along the main wall, his breath catching as he recognized Camilla's distinctive style. One piece in particular drew him closer, a large canvas showing a young couple in what appeared to be this very gallery, surrounded by artwork, their expressions captured, with such love that Stephen felt like an intruder merely witnessing it. Her parents, he realized. The gallery wasn't just a business, it was the physical embodiment of her family's legacy, the last tangible connection to parents taken too soon. The door opened unexpectedly, and an elderly woman with Camilla's eyes and bearing stood in the entrance. "We're closed, but you seem quite interested in that particular painting. Are you an admirer of Camilla's work?" Stephen found himself without his usual verbal armor. Yes, her talent is exceptional." The woman studied him with penetrating intelligence. "You're Stephen Finn." It wasn't a question. Stephen nodded, his usual confidence evaporating under her steady gaze. "I'm Eleanor Grace," she said, making no move to invite him inside. "I imagine you've come to deliver your latest offer in person. A more personal touch, now that the impersonal approach has failed." Her directness, so reminiscent of her granddaughter's, left no room for business platitudes. "No," Stephen said simply. "I've come to withdraw my company's interest in your property." Eleanor's expression revealed nothing. "Have you? And why would the great Stephen Finn suddenly abandon a multi-million-dollar development project?" The question hung between them, demanding truth. Stephen looked past her to the painting of Camilla's parents, finding his answer there. "Because some things are worth more than money," he said quietly. "I didn't understand that before." Eleanor's gaze remained unwavering. "My granddaughter works for you." Again, not a question. Stephen nodded, wondering if Camilla had already called. "Her. She doesn't know I'm here," he said. "We had a disagreement when I learned of the connection." "A disagreement," Eleanor repeated, a hint of wry amusement touching her lips. "That sounds like my Camilla. She has her mother's fire." After a moment's consideration, she stepped aside. "Come in, Mr. Finn. I think we should talk." Inside, the gallery felt even more intimate. Personal photographs mingled with professional artwork, creating a space that was both showcase and shrine to a family's artistic legacy. "This gallery opened 57 years ago," she said, lowering herself carefully into a chair. "My husband and I built it from nothing. Our daughter, Camilla's mother, was raised among these paintings, just as Camilla was after her." Stephen remained standing, acutely aware of being an intruder in this sacred space. "I didn't know the history when my company targeted it for acquisition." "Would it have mattered?" Eleanor asked with penetrating directness. Before Camilla, he admitted, probably not. The honest answer seemed to satisfy something in Eleanor's assessment. And now, Stephen's gaze moved to a small photograph on a nearby table, Camilla as a child, paint-streaked and beaming between two adults who shared her smile. "Now I understand that what looks like a simple business transaction on paper can mean the destruction of something irreplaceable." Eleanor studied him with the same directness he'd come to value in her granddaughter. "Camilla speaks of you." The statement caught Stephen off guard. "She does." A smile touched the older woman's lips. "She's been careful, but a grandmother knows." There's been a change in her voice when she calls, a brightness when she mentions her employer, who seems to be more than just the cold billionaire from the magazines. Heat rose in Stephen's cheeks. "I'm not sure what to say to that." "Say nothing," Eleanor replied simply. "But understand this, Mr. Finn. My granddaughter has known more loss than anyone her age should bear. Her heart is extraordinarily generous, but not indestructible." The warning was gentle, but unmistakable. Stephen nodded, accepting the judgment of a woman who had clearly survived her own share of life's hardships with dignity intact. "The development project will be rerouted," he said firmly. "Your gallery will remain untouched. I'll have the official documentation sent over tomorrow. Eleanor tilted her head, studying him. At what cost to your company? Several million, Stephen admitted. But as I said, some things are worth more than money. Including my granddaughter's good opinion. The question held no judgment, only genuine curiosity. Stephen met her gaze directly. I would like to earn back her trust, yes, but this decision stands regardless of whether that's possible. For the first time, approval warmed Eleanor's expression. You're not what I expected, Stephen Finn. When he returned to the mansion that evening, Stephen found Camilla in the process of packing her belongings, her movements sharp with lingering anger and hurt. You're leaving, he said from the doorway of her quarters, the words more question than statement. Camilla didn't look up. I can't work for someone who's trying to destroy my family's legacy. I've withdrawn the development plans for the gallery's block, Stephen said simply. The official documents will be delivered to your grandmother tomorrow. Camilla's hands stilled, on a half-folded sweater. What? The West Side development will proceed, but with a modified footprint that preserves the gallery and surrounding buildings. Each word came with absolute certainty, the tone he used for irrevocable business decisions. Slowly, Camilla turned to face him. Why? Stephen offered the truth that had crystallized as he stood looking at her paintings through the gallery window. Because I saw your parents in your painting. I saw what that place means to you and your grandmother. He took a breath, stepping further into vulnerability than he had in 15 years. And because hurting you is unacceptable to me, regardless of the business implications. Tears welled in Camilla's eyes. You're sacrificing millions because of me. Not sacrificing, Stephen corrected gently. Gaining perspective. Your grandmother helped me see that. You spoke to my grandmother? Surprise replaced confusion. I visited the gallery this afternoon, he admitted. She's a remarkable woman. I see where you get your strength. A single tear spilled down Camilla's cheek. This doesn't make sense. The Stephen Finn I've read about doesn't change billion-dollar development plans over a small gallery. Perhaps, Stephen said softly. I'm not entirely that man anymore. The admission hung between them, more revealing than any business concession. For 15 years, Stephen Finn had been synonymous with ruthless efficiency and clinical business decisions. Now he stood before her, offering tangible proof that her presence in his life had begun to thaw something fundamental in his approach to the world. Camilla moved toward him slowly, stopping close enough that he could see the lingering uncertainty in her eyes. If I discover this is manipulation... It's not, he interrupted, his voice holding a conviction that brooked no doubt. Call your grandmother if you need confirmation. I believe you, she said quietly, the words carrying weight beyond their simplicity. Relief washed through Stephen, startling in its intensity. The prospect of Camilla walking out of his life had been more devastating than any business setback he had ever faced. Will you stay? He asked, the question making him more vulnerable than any business negotiation ever had. Camilla studied his face, as though searching for the truth beneath his carefully controlled expression. Whatever she saw there must have satisfied her because she nodded slowly. I'll stay, she said, but things have changed between us. You understand that? Stephen nodded, understanding completely. The professional boundaries that had already begun to blur now stood fundamentally altered. Whatever was growing between them could no longer be ignored or dismissed as employer and employee finding common ground. As they stood in the soft evening light, Stephen Finn recognized the magnitude of what had shifted within him. For the first time since inheriting his father's empire, he had made a major business decision based not on profit margins or strategic advantage, but on the simple, powerful truth that Camilla Grace's happiness had become essential to his own. Chapter 6. unspoken. Language. The morning sun bathed the boardroom in golden light, doing little to warm the frosty silence that had descended following Stephen's announcement. 8 pairs of eyes stared at him with expressions ranging from confusion to barely concealed outrage. "Let me understand this correctly," Marcus Davis, his CFO and oldest friend, finally spoke. "We're completely redesigning the West Side development, absorbing millions in additional costs and months of delays to preserve a single art gallery?" Stephen met his gaze evenly. "Not just the gallery. We're preserving the entire historical corner, which will actually enhance the project's cultural appeal." "With all due respect," interjected Diane Winters, head of acquisitions, "this decision seems uncharacteristic of you, Stephen." The careful phrasing did nothing to mask her meaning, that Stephen Finn, renowned for ruthless efficiency, was suddenly making decisions that defied financial logic. Stephen straightened the already perfectly aligned documents before him, buying time to formulate a response that wouldn't reveal the truth, that a pair of amber eyes and a gentle heart had accomplished what 15 years of business adversaries had failed to do, make him question the cold calculation that had built his empire. "I visited the property personally," he said, his tone brooking no argument. "The artistic and historical value presents a unique opportunity to enhance rather than replace. The revised plans are already underway." The board members exchanged looks that spoke volumes, but no one dared challenge him further, a testament to the intimidating reputation he had cultivated over years of uncompromising leadership. The meeting proceeded to other matters, though Stephen felt the undercurrent of confusion that rippled through the room like an invisible tide. Only Marcus lingered after the others had filed out, leaning against the doorframe with the familiarity of someone who had known Stephen since childhood. "Want to tell me what's really going on?" he asked, arms folded across his chest. "Because the Stephen Finn I've known for 30 years doesn't suddenly develop a passion for historical preservation." Stephen busied himself gathering his papers. "Sometimes fresh perspective improves a project." "Fresh perspective," Marcus repeated, skeptically. "This wouldn't have anything to do with your new housekeeper, would it? The one you mentioned has family connections to an art gallery?" Stephen's hand stilled momentarily, enough confirmation for someone who knew him as well as Marcus did. "Interesting," his friend said, a knowing smile spreading across his face. "Very interesting." "It's not what you're thinking," Stephen replied, though even to his own ears the denial lacked conviction. Marcus pushed away from the doorframe, his expression softening. "I haven't seen that look on your face since before. Your parents died, whatever or whoever is causing it, don't push it away." Before Stephen could formulate a response, Marcus was gone, leaving him alone with thoughts he wasn't yet ready to fully examine. The drive home that evening felt different, anticipation replacing the weary resignation that had accompanied his return to the empty mansion for 15 years. As the car wound up the familiar drive, Stephen found himself straightening his tie, running a hand through his hair, small gestures of self-consciousness that would have been unthinkable months ago. Camilla was waiting in the entrance hall as he entered, a tradition that had evolved naturally since the gallery incident 3 weeks earlier. Her smile of greeting sent an increasingly familiar warmth through his chest. "How did the board meeting go?" she asked, taking his briefcase with the easy familiarity that had developed between them. "About as well as could be expected," he replied, following her toward the study. "They think I've lost my mind." Camilla glanced back at him, amusement dancing in her eyes. "Have you?" The simple question carried layers of meaning that hung in the air between them. Stephen found himself smiling, another expression that had been rare before her arrival in his life. "The jury's still out," he said lightly. "But my CFO seems to think I'm showing symptoms of some serious condition." "Oh?" Camilla set his briefcase beside his desk, turning to face him with eyebrows raised. "What condition would that be?" Stephen hesitated, the playful moment suddenly charged with something deeper. Humanity, perhaps. A severe case, apparently. Her laughter filled the study, warming the space in ways the ornate fireplace never had. Highly contagious, I hear, and possibly terminal to your reputation as the Ice King of finance. A price I'm increasingly willing to pay, he admitted, the words more honest than he'd intended. Something shifted in Camilla's expression, a softening, a question, an invitation he wasn't quite brave enough to accept. Instead, she glanced at her watch and smoothly changed the subject. Your dinner will be ready in 30 minutes. Oh, and there's an invitation on your desk, some charity gala next weekend. Stephen nodded, familiar with the endless social obligations that came with his position. Normally his assistant would select which events warranted his appearance, and he would attend with mechanical obligation, making the required connections before retreating as early as propriety allowed. As Camilla turned to leave, a thought, impulsive and entirely uncharacteristic, formed in Stephen's mind. "Camilla," he called, her name still feeling new on his tongue despite the weeks they'd spent in increasingly comfortable companionship. She paused in the doorway, looking back at him expectantly. "Would you—" The words stuck in his throat, a foreign sensation for a man accustomed to boardroom declarations that decided the fates of companies and careers. He cleared his throat and tried again. "Would you consider attending the gala with me? Not as my employee, but as my guest." The invitation hung between them, transforming the air in the room to something electric. Camilla's eyes widened slightly, her lips parting in evident surprise. "As your date," she clarified, her directness both challenging and endearing. Heat rose in Stephen's cheeks, an entirely unfamiliar sensation that both unnerved and exhilarated him. "Yes," he said simply, deciding that honesty was simpler than evasion. "If you'd like to." Camilla studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. "What would your board members think? The great Stephen Finn, arriving with his housekeeper on his arm." The question wasn't bitter or accusatory, merely practical, acknowledging the vast gulf between their worlds that had gradually narrowed within the confines of the mansion, but remained stark beyond its gates. "I find I care less about their opinions with each passing day," Stephen answered truthfully. A smile slowly bloomed across Camilla's face, transforming her already beautiful features into something that made Stephen's carefully regulated heartbeat stutter. "Then yes," she said, "I'd be honored to attend with you." The simple acceptance sent a current of something like joy through Stephen's veins, an emotion so long absent he barely recognized it. "I don't have anything suitable to wear for such an event," Camilla added, practical concern following her acceptance. Stephen hesitated, then offered tentatively, "There are dresses. My mother's collection is still in storage. If you wouldn't find it uncomfortable, perhaps there might be something there." The suggestion was intimate in ways he hadn't fully considered until the words left his mouth. Offering pieces of his mother's life to Camilla seemed significant in ways he couldn't quite articulate. "I'd be honored," she said softly, understanding, evident in her expression. The following afternoon found them in the rarely visited East Wing, where climate-controlled rooms preserved Margaret Finn's extensive wardrobe. Stephen unlocked the door with a key he still carried, though he hadn't entered the space in years. The room smelled faintly of cedar and the delicate perfume his mother had favored, the scent triggering memories Stephen had carefully compartmentalized. Since her death, Camilla moved reverently among the preserved gowns, her fingers tracing fine fabrics with an artist's appreciation. "She had exquisite taste," she said, looking back at Stephen, who remained near the doorway, unwilling to fully enter. A space so haunted by absence. "She would have liked you," he found himself saying. "She valued authenticity above all else." Camilla smiled, the expression softened by understanding of what this moment cost him. "Would you help me choose something?" Something you think she would have wanted to see worn again? The request drew him reluctantly into the room, where he moved among his mother's possessions with careful reverence. Despite his usual disinterest in fashion, memories guided his hands to a particular garment bag. "This one," he said, unzipping it to reveal an emerald gown of flowing silk, its classic lines both elegant and understated. It was always her favorite for winter events. Camilla touched the fabric with gentle fingers. "It's beautiful." "Would you like to try it on?" Stephen asked, the question emerging more hesitantly than any multi-million-dollar proposal he'd ever presented. Camilla nodded, taking the dress with careful hands. "I'll just be a moment." She disappeared behind an ornate dressing screen that had been his mother's, leaving Stephen standing uncomfortably in a room filled with memories he'd spent 15 years avoiding. His attention fixed on a framed photograph he'd forgotten. His parents at a charity event similar to the one he'd invited Camilla to attend, his mother resplendent in the very gown he'd just offered. "How does it look?" Camilla's voice pulled him from his reverie. He turned, words of polite appreciation dying in his throat as she stepped from behind the screen. The emerald silk draped perfectly over her curves, the color magnificent against her dark skin, the classic cut seeming designed for her despite having been created decades earlier. But it was her expression, a mixture of uncertainty and quiet dignity, that struck him most profoundly, reminiscent of his mother, yet entirely, uniquely Camilla. "You look—" Stephen searched for adequate words and found his usually precise vocabulary failing him. "Perfect," he finally managed, the single word holding more genuine emotion than most of his carefully crafted business speeches. A blush darkened Camilla's cheeks. "Are you sure it's appropriate for me to wear your mother's dress?" Stephen moved toward her, stopping close enough to catch the subtle scent of her perfume, mingling with the room's preserved memories. "She would have been honored," he said softly, "as am I." Their eyes held for a moment that stretched beyond the conventional boundaries of employer and employee, man and woman, past and present, converging in a silent acknowledgement of something neither was quite ready to name. The night of the gala arrived clear and cold, stars scattered like diamonds across the winter sky. Stephen waited at the foot of the grand staircase, adjusting cufflinks that suddenly felt too tight. The sound of footsteps drew his attention upward, where Camilla descended in his mother's emerald gown, her hair swept up to reveal the elegant line of her neck, her only jewelry simple pearl earrings that had been delivered to her room that morning. Another gift Stephen had left without a note, allowing her the space to accept or decline without obligation. She had worn them, he noted, with satisfaction that warmed his chest. "You look stunning," he said as she reached the bottom step, his voice rougher than intended. Camilla smiled, the expression lighting her eyes. "You clean up pretty well yourself, Mr. Finn." "Stephen," he corrected gently. "If we're attending as equals, I think first names are appropriate." "Stephen," she repeated, the simple words somehow intimate on her lips. He offered his arm with a formality that belied the rapid beating of his heart. "Shall we?" The moment her hand settled in the crook of his elbow, Stephen felt something fundamental shift between them, a threshold crossed that could never be uncrossed, regardless of what the evening might bring. In the car, he found himself uncharacteristically nervous, glancing at her more often than the passing scenery. When she caught him looking the third time, Camilla laughed softly. "What is it?" she asked. "Do I have lipstick on my teeth?" "No," Stephen replied, embarrassed at being caught. I'm not used to having company at these events." "Are you having second thoughts?" The question was asked lightly, but he caught the flicker of uncertainty beneath it. "Not at all," he assured her, impulsively covering her hand with his own. "Quite the opposite. I find I'm actually looking forward to an event for the first time in years." The simple truth hung between them as the car wound through the city streets toward the glittering hotel where New York's elite gathered to perform the elaborate dance of philanthropy and social positioning. As they pulled up to the entrance, Stephen squeezed Camilla's hand gently. "Ready?" he asked. Her smile, confident and genuine, steadied something in his chest. "Ready." As they stepped from the car together, camera flashes erupted around them. The notorious Stephen Finn making a rare social appearance with an unknown woman on his arm. Camilla hesitated momentarily, clearly unprepared for the attention. "Ignore them," Stephen murmured, his hand settling protectively at the small of her back. "They're irrelevant." With that simple touch, they crossed another threshold together, stepping from the private understanding they had built within the mansion's walls into a public declaration neither had fully anticipated, but neither now seemed willing to avoid. Chapter 7. The Garden Confession. The morning newspapers arrived at Finn Manor with predictable headlines: Ice King's mystery woman, billionaire Finn's surprising date, and various speculations about Camilla's identity. Stephen found them spread across the kitchen island when he entered, earlier than his usual hour. Camilla stood at the counter, her back to him, as she prepared coffee. Without turning, she said, "Your public relations team has called 3 times already. Let them." "Wait," Stephen replied, moving to stand beside her. "Are you all right?" She turned to face him, a wry smile playing at her lips. "I'm fine, though I suspect I've complicated your life rather significantly." "Improved," he corrected without hesitation. "Not complicated." The simple declaration hung between them more honest than either had expected this early in the morning. Camilla handed him a coffee cup, their fingers brushing in a way that now felt deliberate rather than accidental. The following week brought a new intensity to Stephen's work schedule. The fallout from both the West Side development changes and his public appearance with Camilla requiring careful management. Yet each evening found him returning home earlier than his previous habits, drawn by the knowledge that she would be waiting. Friday afternoon, his car pulled up the mansion's drive earlier than usual, a meeting cancelled at the last minute giving him unexpected free hours. He found Marcus waiting in his study, examining the thriving orchid Camilla had placed there weeks earlier. "Breaking your own schedule?" his friend observed with knowing amusement. "The world really has tilted on its axis." Stephen set down his briefcase with deliberate calm. "I assume you're here for a reason beyond commentary on my personal habits." Marcus smiled, unperturbed by the coolness. "The board is requesting an official statement about your relationship with Miss Grace. The business journals are running wild with speculation, and major shareholders are asking questions." Tension tightened Stephen's shoulders. "My personal life is not subject to shareholder approval." "Perhaps not," Marcus agreed, "but perception affects stock prices. You know this better than anyone." He paused, studying Stephen with the candor of old friendship. "She's your housekeeper, Stephen." "She's more than that." The words emerged before Stephen could consider their implications, hanging in the air between them like a confession. Marcus's expression softened. "I can see that. So can anyone who saw you together at the gala." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Look, I'm not here as your CFO right now. I'm here as the friend who's watched you bury yourself in work for 15 years. If she's bringing you back to life, I'm all for it." Stephen moved to the window, looking out toward the conservatory, where Camilla worked among the now thriving plants. "It's complicated." "It always is," Marcus replied, joining him at the window. His eyebrows rose as he followed Stephen's gaze. "She's transformed that space." "She transforms everything she touches," Stephen said quietly, the simple truth emerging. Before he could guard against it, Marcus studied his oldest friend with undisguised wonder. "You're in love with her." The word love hung in the air between them, simultaneously too large and too inadequate for the complex emotions that had developed within Stephen. "I don't know what I am," he admitted, the uncertainty unfamiliar. Territory for a man accustomed to clear strategies and defined outcomes. "Well," Marcus said, clapping him on the shoulder, "when you figure it out, maybe let her know before the rest of the board." His expression grew more serious. "But Stephen, whatever this is, be certain she doesn't strike me as someone who does anything halfway." After Marcus left, Stephen remained at the window, watching Camilla move among the plants with graceful purpose. With sudden decision, he left his study and made his way to the conservatory. Camilla looked up at his approach, surprise evident in her expression. "You're home early," she observed, setting aside her pruning shears. "The Westfield meeting was cancelled," he explained, moving closer. "I thought perhaps, that is, if you're not too busy." The uncharacteristic hesitation brought a smile to Camilla's lips. "Yes?" Stephen squared his shoulders, as though preparing for a challenging negotiation. "I thought we might work on the new section of the garden together. The eastern bed you mentioned, wanting to replant." The request clearly surprised her. "You want to garden in that suit?" A flush crept up Stephen's neck. "I can change." 20 minutes later, Stephen Finn stood in the mansion's expansive gardens, wearing simple dark jeans and a grey Henley. Camilla joined him, carrying gardening tools and barely concealing her amusement at his obvious discomfort with being so underdressed. "I'm not sure I trust that expression," he said, eyeing her suspiciously. Camilla laughed, the sound like music, in the crisp afternoon air. "I'm just trying to reconcile the Stephen Finn of the financial papers with the man standing before me ready to dig in the dirt." "They're not entirely the same person anymore," he admitted, accepting the gardening gloves she offered. "Though I should warn you, I haven't done this since I was a child. My mother tried to teach me, but I was more interested in mathematics than mulch." "It's not complicated," Camilla assured him, kneeling beside the empty bed. "The earth knows what to do. We just have to give it the right conditions." For the next 2 hours, they worked side by side, Camilla patiently demonstrating how to prepare the soil, plant delicate bulbs, and arrange the flowering shrubs she had selected. Stephen listened with the same intense focus he brought to complex business negotiations. "Gently," she corrected, watching him handle a particularly delicate root system. "Plants respond to touch, just like people." Stephen adjusted his approach, fingertips carefully arranging the roots before covering them with soil. "Like this?" Camilla nodded approvingly. "Perfect." As the afternoon light softened toward evening, Stephen found himself covered in soil, sweat dampening his shirt, yet more content than he had felt in recent memory. Camilla worked beside him, occasionally brushing against him in ways that sent awareness through his body. "My mother would be stunned to see me like this," he admitted, sitting back on his heels to survey their progress. "She tried for years to get me interested in her gardens." "What changed?" Camilla asked, reaching across him for another plant, her arm briefly pressing against his chest. Stephen hesitated, then decided on honesty. "You did." The simple admission hung between them, weighted with more meaning than the two words could reasonably contain. Camilla stilled, her eyes lifting to meet his. "She would be proud," she said softly, "to see you remembering how to nurture living things." "I've been surrounded by wealth and power for so long," Stephen replied, surprising himself with his candor, "that I forgot what it means to create something that asks nothing in return except care." Camilla's smile held a tenderness that reached places within him long left barren. "That's the secret of gardening. You give freely, and sometimes, if you're patient, something beautiful grows." The parallel to what had developed between them hung, unspoken, in the air. Stephen found himself leaning toward her, drawn by a force more powerful than the gravity that had kept him earthbound in business ambitions for 15 years. Their hands, dirt-streaked and bare of pretension, met in the soil. Between newly planted flowers, the connection, simple and profound, sent warmth spreading through Stephen's chest. This woman, who had entered his life as his employee, had somehow become the axis around which his world now turned. "Camilla," he began, his voice rougher than intended, "I need to tell you—" The shrill ring of his phone shattered the moment. Stephen closed his eyes briefly, frustration evident in the tightening of his jaw as he recognized his assistant's ringtone. "You should take that," Camilla said gently. "It might be important." Reluctantly, Stephen withdrew his hand from hers and retrieved his phone. "Finn," he answered tersely, his expression darkened as he listened. "When?" he demanded. "Who leaked it?" Another pause. "I'll be there in an hour." He ended the call and turned back to Camilla, regret evident in his expression. "I have to go. There's a situation with Westfield Industries." "Your competitor?" she asked, concern replacing the warmth in her eyes. Stephen nodded grimly. "They're attempting a hostile takeover of one of our subsidiary companies. The timing is too perfect to be coincidence. They're exploiting the board's current uncertainty about my leadership." "Uncertainty caused by me," Camilla said quietly, the realization clear in her expression. "No," Stephen replied firmly, "by my own choices, none of which I regret." He reached for her hand again, heedless of the dirt smudging both their skin. "I'll handle this quickly and return. We have a conversation to finish." The intensity in his gaze left no doubt about his meaning. Whatever had been building between them over months of gradually dissolving barriers had reached a point where words were needed. Truths that could no longer remain unspoken. Camilla squeezed his hand gently. "I'll be here." As Stephen drove toward the city, he found himself at a crossroads unlike any he had faced. For 15 years, Finn Enterprises had been his singular focus, his identity, his purpose, his sanctuary from emotional entanglements that threatened the order he craved. Now, racing toward a corporate crisis, Stephen realized with startling clarity that his priorities had fundamentally shifted. The company still mattered, but it no longer defined him completely. Somewhere between winter storms and garden soil, between shared confidences and silent understanding, Camilla Grace had reawakened parts of himself he had buried alongside his parents, parts that longed for connection beyond balance sheets and boardrooms. As city lights appeared on the horizon, Stephen made a decision that would have been unthinkable months earlier. He would address this crisis efficiently and return to the conversation interrupted in the garden, to the woman whose gentle strength had breached walls built over 15 years of careful isolation, to the truth he was finally ready to acknowledge, that somewhere between caution and surrender he had fallen in love with Camilla Grace. Chapter 8. Second Twist. The Betrayal of Trust. Night had fallen completely by the time Stephen returned to the mansion, exhaustion etched into his face. The emergency board meeting had stretched for hours as they grappled with Westfield's unexpected attack on their holdings. They had established temporary defenses, but the threat remained, precise and targeted in ways that suggested inside knowledge. The house stood silent as he entered. Stephen found a note on the garden table in Camilla's graceful handwriting. Had to check on grandmother, left dinner in the warming oven, rest well. See, disappointment settled in Stephen's chest. Their interrupted conversation would have to wait until morning, along with the revelation he had finally allowed himself to acknowledge during the tense drive back from the city. He was in love with Camilla Grace. The realization had crystallized with stunning clarity while his board debated financial strategies, that the woman who had entered his home as an employee had become essential to his happiness in ways that transcended the careful boundaries he had maintained for 15 years. His phone chimed with a message from Marcus, Security flagged something concerning, coming over with files first thing tomorrow. 7 a.m. sharp. The cryptic message furrowed Stephen's brow, but exhaustion won out over curiosity. Whatever new crisis had emerged could wait until morning. Sunrise found Stephen in his study, reviewing reports on Westfield's aggressive moves while waiting for Marcus. The familiar routine of business analysis provided comforting structure, while his thoughts continually drifted to more personal matters, what he would say to Camilla when she returned. A sharp knock preceded Marcus's entrance, his expression unusually grave as he carried a sealed folder. "What couldn't wait?" Stephen asked, setting aside his coffee. Marcus hesitated, tension evident in his normally relaxed demeanor. "This is difficult, Stephen. Security flagged some anomalies in the system. Someone has been accessing sensitive files, acquisition strategies, board minutes, financial projections. A data breach." Stephen straightened, CEO instincts immediately engaging. "Internal access," Marcus clarified, placing the folder on the desk. "Using authorized credentials. Your credentials specifically." Stephen's eyes narrowed. "That's impossible. I never share my login information." "I know." Marcus's expression remained troubled. "That's why security investigated further. The access occurred from your home network, primarily late evenings and early mornings." The implication hung in the air between them. Stephen's jaw tightened as he reached for the folder. "You think someone in my household is responsible?" Inside the folder, security reports documented access times, file locations, and most damning, grainy security footage from the downtown office showing a familiar figure using Stephen's private elevator access card 3 days earlier, during hours when he had been in meetings across town. Camilla. Stephen stared at the image, a cold weight settling in his chest. "There must be some explanation." "There's more," Marcus said reluctantly, retrieving his tablet. "Given the timing of Westfield's moves against us, security did some additional digging." He placed the tablet before Stephen, displaying photographs that stole the breath from his lungs. Camilla, seated across from Michael Westfield at a small cafe, their conversation clearly intense, another showing her entering Westfield Industries, glancing over her shoulder as though checking if she was followed. "When?" Stephen asked, his voice barely audible. "The cafe meeting was 2 weeks ago. The office visit 3 days ago, the same day our security system recorded her using your access card downtown." Stephen stood abruptly, moving to the window, as though physical distance might somehow diminish the impact of the evidence before him. Every instinct honed through 15 years of corporate warfare told him the conclusion was obvious. Camilla had betrayed him, using their growing closeness to access sensitive information for his greatest business rival. Yet something deeper than business instinct rebelled against this interpretation. The part of him that had watched her gentle hands nurture dying plants back to life, that had seen her genuine care for her grandmother, that had felt the authentic connection growing between them. "Have you confronted her?" Marcus asked gently. "She's not here," Stephen replied, his mind racing to reconcile the woman he thought he knew with the evidence before him. "She went to check on her grandmother last night." Marcus sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Look, I know what she's come to mean to you. That's why I brought this personally instead of involving the full security team. But Stephen, the timing aligns perfectly. She arrives in your life, gains your trust, and suddenly Westfield has inside information on our most sensitive strategies." The logical assessment struck with painful accuracy, yet Stephen found himself searching for alternative explanations, unwilling to believe the connection that had transformed his life was built on deception. "I need to speak with her directly," he said finally. The sound of the front door opening jerked him from his thoughts. Camilla's voice drifted down the corridor as she spoke with Marcus, who had apparently lingered in the entrance hall. Stephen gathered the photographs with trembling hands, sliding them back into the folder as footsteps approached his study. Camilla appeared in the doorway, concern etched across her features. "Stephen." Marcus seemed upset. "Is everything all right?" With the company, the sound of his first name on her lips, once a symbol of their evolving relationship, now twisted painfully in his chest. Stephen's gaze moved over her face, searching for signs of deception he might have missed beneath her warmth and authenticity. "Where were you yesterday evening?" he asked, his voice carefully controlled. Confusion flickered across her expression. "With my grandmother, as I wrote in my note. Her symptoms were worse and the nurse called." "And before that?" Stephen pressed, watching her closely. "3 days ago, when you said you were visiting the gallery." Camilla's brow furrowed deeper. "I was at the gallery. What's this about, Stephen?" He retrieved the folder, removing the security image of her using his access card. "Then perhaps you can explain this." Color drained from Camilla's face as she stared at the photograph. "Where did you get this?" "Security flagged unauthorized access to sensitive files," Stephen replied, his tone growing colder with each word. "Files that would be extremely valuable to a competitor. Files accessed using my credentials from this house during hours when I was away." Understanding dawned in Camilla's eyes, followed immediately by indignation. "You think I'm stealing information from you?" "The evidence is compelling." Stephen laid out the photographs of her with Westfield, watching as her expression shifted from shock to something like horror. "This isn't what it looks like," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Then explain," Stephen demanded, the control he'd maintained beginning to fracture. "Explain why you've been meeting with my greatest business rival while accessing confidential information from my private accounts." Camilla's hands trembled as she picked up the cafe photograph. "I met with Michael Westfield because he funds a research initiative for the treatment my grandmother needs. The hospital administrator connected us when they learned of his interest in her specific condition." The explanation was plausible enough to give Stephen pause, but not sufficient to explain the rest. "And your visit to Westfield Industries, your use of my security credentials downtown." "I never used your credentials," Camilla insisted, genuine, distress evident in her voice. "I've never accessed your files or taken anything from your accounts." "The security logs indicate otherwise," Stephen replied, the part of him trained to detect business deception warring with the part that had come. "To trust her completely, then someone else did it," she said firmly. "Someone who wants you to believe it was me." The convenient denial struck against 15 years of corporate paranoia, awakening the cold calculation that had protected Stephen through countless attempts to undermine his empire. "That's a convenient explanation," hurt flashed across Camilla's features, followed by a spark of anger. "After everything we've shared, you believe I would betray you like this? That everything between us has been some elaborate corporate espionage? I believed my parents would always be there," Stephen said, old pain bleeding into his words. "I believed in many things that proved false. Evidence doesn't lie, Camilla." "People lie," she countered, her voice breaking slightly. "People create false evidence. Have you considered that Westfield might be setting me up precisely because he's realized what I've come to mean to you?" The possibility had occurred to Stephen, but seemed less convincing than the weight of evidence before him. "Why would he target you specifically? Why not any other employee?" Camilla stared at him, realization dawning in her eyes. "You haven't seen the society pages, have you? The photographs from the gala are everywhere, along with speculation about us. Anyone watching would see that I—" She stopped, pain evident in her expression. "That you what?" Stephen pressed. "That I've fallen in love with you," she finished quietly, the declaration emerging not as she must have imagined it would, but as part of a desperate defense against accusations of betrayal. The words Stephen had longed to hear, now twisted painfully, in his chest, tainted by doubt. He turned away, unable to bear the sincerity in her eyes when set against the evidence in his hands. "I need you to leave," he said, the words emerging with a coldness he had never directed at her before. "Stephen," Camilla stepped forward, reaching for him. "Please, whatever you're seeing here is not the truth. Someone is manipulating you. Manipulating us. The facts speak for themselves," he replied, drawing on the detached analysis that had served him through countless business confrontations. "My security access was used. Files were compromised. You've been meeting with Westfield. There are explanations, which conveniently cannot be verified," Stephen interrupted, retreating behind the walls he had begun to lower in her presence. "I allowed myself to believe you were different, that what was growing between us was genuine. That was my mistake." Tears welled in Camilla's eyes, but she blinked them back, pride straightening her spine. "After everything we've shared, everything you've seen of me, my care for my grandmother, my passion for art, my honesty with you from the beginning, you choose to believe I've been deceiving you all along." The question struck deeper than Stephen wanted to acknowledge, piercing the protective armor he was desperately trying to reconstruct around his heart. "Trust was a luxury I abandoned when I inherited this company at 20, he said quietly. "I forgot that lesson. It won't happen again." Pain flashed across Camilla's features, followed by a quiet dignity that only intensified the ache in Stephen's chest. "When your parents died, you built walls to protect yourself from hurt," she said, softly. "I understand that, but walls don't just keep pain out, Stephen. They keep love out too." She placed the photographs gently on his desk, her fingers lingering for a moment on the image of them at the gala. Her in his mother's emerald dress. Him looking at her with an expression now painful to witness. "I have never betrayed you," she said, meeting his gaze directly. "I never would. When you're ready to believe that, you know where to find me." Without waiting for his response, Camilla turned and walked from the study, her footsteps echoing down the corridor with a finality that reverberated through Stephen's chest. The sound of the front door closing minutes later confirmed what he already knew. She had left Finn Manor, taking with her the warmth and connection that had begun to transform his carefully ordered existence. Alone in his study, Stephen stared at the photographs spread before him, the alleged evidence of betrayal set against the undeniable evidence of their connection captured at the gala. For 15 years, he had made decisions based on cold calculation and protective distance, insulating himself from the vulnerability his parents' sudden death had taught him to fear. Now, having finally opened himself to the possibility of something more meaningful than business success, he had retreated to those same protective habits at the first suggestion of betrayal, choosing to believe the worst rather than trust the connection that had awakened parts of himself long dormant. Chapter 9. The Depths of Surrender. Days bled into a week of hollow routine after Camilla's departure. Stephen moved through his life with mechanical precision, immersing himself in the battle against Westfield's takeover attempt with single-minded focus that reminded his executive team of the ruthless efficiency that had built his empire. In boardrooms and strategy sessions, the cold, calculating Stephen Finn had returned in full force, sharper, more merciless than before, as though personal pain had honed his business instincts to a devastating edge. Yet those closest to him noticed the cost. The brief glimpses of humanity that had begun to emerge during Camilla's presence had vanished entirely. Dark circles, shadowed eyes that had briefly known warmth, now frozen once more in glacial detachment. He arrived earlier, stayed later, and spoke only of business matters, as though anything personal had become forbidden territory. At the mansion, silence reigned where Camilla's laughter had once brightened stone halls. The conservatory plants began to wilt without her care, the garden they had planted together abandoned to the elements. Stephen avoided both spaces entirely, confining himself to his study during the few hours he spent at home, surrounded by financial reports, rather than face the emptiness her absence had created. On the 8th day, Marcus found him at the office long after midnight, illuminated only by the glow of his computer screen as he analyzed market projections. "You need to sleep," Marcus said from the doorway. Stephen didn't look up. "I'll sleep when Westfield's threat is neutralized." Marcus stepped into the office, closing the door behind him. "This isn't just about Westfield, and we both know it." "I'm not discussing this," Stephen replied, his tone leaving no room for argument. "The security team completed their full investigation," Marcus continued anyway, placing a folder on the desk. "I thought you should see the results immediately." Something in his friend's voice finally drew Stephen's attention from the screen. "What did they find?" "Evidence of sophisticated digital manipulation," Marcus said quietly. "The timestamps on the security footage were altered. The access logs were falsified. Someone went to extraordinary lengths to create a trail leading to Camilla." A cold weight settled in Stephen's stomach. "Are you certain?" Marcus nodded. "Beyond doubt. Our chief security officer believes it's the work of the same group that attempted to breach our systems last year, likely hired by Westfield this time, with much more specific targets." "And Camilla's meetings with Westfield?" Stephen asked, afraid to hope, yet unable to stop himself. "The medical research connection checks out," Marcus confirmed. "Westfield does fund a specialized treatment program at her grandmother's hospital. Their meeting appears to have been arranged by the hospital administrator, exactly as she claimed." The confirmation of Camilla's innocence struck Stephen with physical force, the truth he had refused to believe now irrefutable. She had never betrayed him. The connection that had transformed his life had been genuine, and he had rejected it, rejected her, at the first suggestion of deception. "Where is she now?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "Security hasn't located her," Marcus admitted. "She hasn't returned to her previous apartment, and the gallery has been closed for renovations." Stephen closed his eyes briefly, the magnitude of his error washing over him in waves of regret. For 15 years, he had protected himself from vulnerability, only to inflict the very wound he feared most upon the woman who had breached his carefully constructed walls. "I need to find her," he said, rising from his desk with sudden urgency. Marcus nodded, understanding in his eyes. "I thought you might say that. I had them check hospitals in the area. Her grandmother was admitted to Metropolitan 3 days ago. Respiratory complications." Without another word, Stephen gathered his coat and phone, moving with purpose that had nothing to do with business strategy for the first time in 8 days. As he reached the door, Marcus called after him, "Stephen." His oldest friend's expression held rare gentleness. "Whatever you say to her, make sure it's the whole truth this time." The drive to Metropolitan Hospital seemed interminable, each red light an unbearable delay as Stephen rehearsed and discarded explanations, apologies, declarations, none of which seemed adequate to address the magnitude of his mistake. The business acumen that had served him through countless negotiations offered no guidance for this most personal of reconciliations. The hospital corridors stretched before him, antiseptic and anonymous under fluorescent lighting. At the nurse's station, he learned Eleanor Grace had been moved to intensive care, visitors limited to immediate family. Without his usual identification or the corporate influence he typically wielded, Stephen found himself in unfamiliar territory, powerless, in a system that didn't recognize wealth or status as currency. "Please," he said to the night nurse, abandoning pride for simple honesty, "I need to see Camilla Grace. It's urgent." Something in his expression must have conveyed his desperation, for the nurse studied him with professional assessment before, responding, "Room 412, but if you upset her, I'll have security remove you. She's been through enough already." The simple defense of Camilla by this stranger struck Stephen with unexpected force. A reminder that while he had spent days nursing wounded pride and suspicion, Camilla had been here, facing her grandmother's decline without the support he should have provided. He found her in a dimly lit room, curled in an uncomfortable chair beside a hospital bed where Eleanor slept, oxygen tubes and monitoring equipment creating a fragile barrier between life and what lay beyond. Camilla's head rested against the chair back, exhaustion having finally claimed her. Even in sleep, worry lined her face, shadows beneath her eyes, speaking of nights without rest. Stephen stood frozen in the doorway, the sight of her overwhelming in its impact after days of absence. He had rehearsed opening lines during the drive, yet now found himself speechless, humbled by the simple dignity with which she maintained her vigil, despite the dual blows of her grandmother's deteriorating health and his own cruel rejection. Though sensing his presence, Camilla stirred, her eyes opening slowly before widening as she registered who stood before her. In an instant she was fully alert, rising from the chair with protective instinct to position herself between him and her grandmother's bed. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice hoarse from sleep and days of worry. Stephen took a step forward, stopping when she tensed. "Marcus brought me the security report," he said quietly. "The evidence against you was fabricated. All of it." Something flickered across Camilla's features, vindication without triumph, too exhausted for celebration. "I told you that." The simple statement laid bare the crux of his failure, that he had chosen to believe manipulated evidence over the woman whose honesty had been consistent from their first meeting. "I know," Stephen admitted, shame evident in his voice. "I should have trusted you." Camilla's posture remained guarded, her arms crossed protectively across her chest. "Yes, you should have." The deserved rebuke hung between them as Eleanor stirred slightly in her sleep, a monitoring machine beeping softly before, returning to its rhythmic pattern. "How is she?" Stephen asked, genuine concern overriding his personal agenda. Camilla's expression softened slightly as she glanced at her grandmother. "Stable for now. The new treatment was working, but the stress of everything." She trailed off, the implication clear without direct accusation. Stephen moved closer. Close. Enough to see the signs of strain in the face that had haunted his thoughts since her departure. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "Not just for doubting you, but for not being here when you needed support." "You made your choice," Camilla replied, weariness rather than bitterness coloring her words. "You chose what you've always chosen, protective distance over trust, suspicion over connection." The assessment was painfully accurate, slicing through the justifications Stephen had constructed around his decision. "Yes," he acknowledged, "I did what I've done for 15 years. I retreated behind walls when faced with potential hurt." "And now," Camilla asked, meeting his gaze directly for the first time, "why are you here, Stephen?" The question demanded absolute truth, stripped of business calculation or practiced charm. Stephen found himself reaching for words he had never spoken aloud. Emotions he had denied since his parents' death had taught him the devastating cost of attachment. "Because I love you," he said simply, the declaration emerging not as he had imagined in the conservatory or garden, but here in the sterile hospital room where Camilla faced yet another potential loss. "Because the thought of you going through this alone while I hid behind wounded pride is unbearable. Because these past 8 days have shown me that safety without you isn't worth the protection it provides." Camilla's eyes widened, tears gathering but not falling. "You love me," she repeated, the words somewhere between question and statement. "Yes," Stephen confirmed, taking another step toward her. I think I have, since you dropped my mother's cufflink down the sink and retrieved it without hesitation. Or perhaps since you stayed with me through the storm. Or when you brought life back to her conservatory. I don't know exactly when it happened, only that it did. Completely and irrevocably. A single tear escaped, tracing a path down Camilla's cheek. And yet you believed I betrayed you so easily. The painful contradiction hung between them. Stephen's hands opened and closed at his sides, restraining the impulse to reach for her when he had not yet earned that right. I believed what 15 years of isolation had trained me to believe, he admitted, that connection leads to vulnerability, and vulnerability leads to pain. That trust is a luxury I couldn't afford. Those beliefs protected you, Camilla observed, her perceptiveness undiminished by exhaustion. No, Stephen countered gently. They imprisoned me. I built walls so high that when someone finally breached them, I panicked at the first sign they might hurt me rather than trust what we had built together. From the hospital bed, Eleanor's voice emerged, surprisingly strong despite her condition. He's right, Camilla. Walls that high don't protect, they suffocate. Both turned in surprise to find Eleanor's eyes open, watching their exchange with the quiet wisdom that had guided her through decades of loss and recovery. Grandma, you should be resting. Camilla moved immediately to her side, concern replacing all other emotions. Eleanor reached for her granddaughter's hand, then extended her other toward Stephen in clear invitation. After a moment's hesitation, he stepped forward to take it, oddly vulnerable under the scrutiny of this woman who had seen through his corporate facade from their first meeting. I watched my granddaughter fall in love with you, Eleanor said, her voice softening with each word as though the effort of speaking drained her limited energy. I saw the light return to her eyes when she spoke of you. The man capable of awakening such joy cannot be the same man who would discard it so carelessly. I made a terrible mistake, Stephen acknowledged, humbled by her unexpected advocacy. Eleanor's grip tightened slightly on both their hands. Life is too short and too precious to waste on pride or fear, believe me. Her gaze moved meaningfully to the medical equipment surrounding her. Second chances are rare gifts. Only fools reject them. Tears flowed freely down Camilla's face now, the combined stress of her grandmother's condition and Stephen's return overwhelming her careful composure. Releasing their hands, Eleanor gestured weakly toward the door. Go, she instructed softly. I need rest, and you two need to finish this conversation without an old woman eavesdropping. Reluctantly, Camilla leaned down to kiss her grandmother's forehead. I'll be just outside. Press the call button if you need anything. Eleanor nodded, her eyes already drifting closed. I'm fine. Go heal what's broken between you. In the quiet corridor outside, Stephen and Camilla stood facing each other, the sterile hospital lighting casting shadows that accentuated the strain of separation on both their faces. She's always been the wisest person I know, Camilla said softly, glancing back toward the room. She reminds me of my mother, Stephen admitted, the ability to see beneath surfaces to what matters. Camilla wrapped her arms around herself, vulnerability evident in the gesture. What happens now, Stephen? You've apologized, you've declared your feelings. Do we simply return to where we were, pretending the doubt never existed? The question cut to the heart of what stood between them, not just his mistrust, but the fundamental patterns that had allowed that mistrust to overrule their connection. No, Stephen said firmly, not to where we were, to something better. He took a breath, stepping into vulnerability with conscious intention rather than the accidental openings that had characterized their early relationship. For 15 years, I've operated from a place of protective distance, making decisions based on minimizing potential hurt rather than maximizing potential joy. He moved closer, close enough to see the flecks of gold in her amber eyes, yet not touching her. I don't want to be that man anymore, Camilla. The man who chooses safety over connection, who retreats behind walls at the first sign of vulnerability. These past 8 days have shown me what that kind of protection costs, and it's far too high a price. Words are easy, Camilla said, quietly. Changing patterns that have defined you for 15 years is not. You're right, Stephen acknowledged, which is why I'm not asking you to simply forgive and forget. I'm asking for the chance to show you, day by day, choice by choice, that I can be the man worthy of what we were building together. The man who trusts not because it's safe, but because some things are worth the risk. Tears gathered in Camilla's eyes again, but she blinked them back. I want to believe that's possible. It already began the moment you walked into my study for your interview, Stephen said softly. You've been changing me since the first day, Camilla. I just didn't recognize the transformation until I tried to go back to the man I was before you. He reached for her hand then, offering rather than taking, leaving the choice to accept the contact entirely hers. After a moment's hesitation that stretched his heart painfully, Camilla's fingers met his, the simple connection sending warmth through his chest despite the hospital's chill. I can't promise I'll never doubt again, he said honestly. 15 years of armor doesn't disappear overnight, but I can promise I'll fight for us rather than against us when those doubts arise, that I'll choose trust over fear, vulnerability over protection. Camilla's fingers tightened around his, her eyes searching his face for truth beyond words. And I can't promise I'll never give you reason to worry, she replied with equal honesty. I'm human, flawed and complex, but I can promise that my heart has been yours since you cancelled a multi-million-dollar development to save my grandmother's gallery. Since you worked beside me in the garden, dirt on your hands and uncertainty in your eyes. Since long before I was ready to admit it to myself. The declaration, their second exchange of love, separated by doubt and reconciliation, hung between them not as a perfect resolution, but as a beginning. Stephen lifted his free hand to gently brush a tear from her cheek, the touch reverent in its restraint. Where do we go from here? He asked softly. Camilla glanced back toward her grandmother's room, conflict evident in her expression. Right now, I can't leave her. I wouldn't ask you to, Stephen replied immediately. Whatever you need, private nurses, specialists, are comfortable. Suite instead of this standard room, it's yours. Not to buy forgiveness, but because I want to support you through this however you'll allow me. Gratitude softened Camilla's expression. Thank you, but what I need most right now isn't financial support. It's simply not being alone. Stephen understood the deeper request beneath her words. I'll stay, he promised, for as long as you want. Me here. As if to seal this pledge, a nurse approached with 2 cups of coffee, offering them with a knowing smile. I thought you both might need these. It's going to be a long night. Accepting the small kindness, they moved to a nearby sitting area, still connected by their joined hands. The path ahead remained uncertain. Eleanor's health, the rebuilding of trust between them, the integration of their vastly different worlds, all presenting challenges yet to be navigated. Yet as they sat together in the quiet hospital corridor, the simple act of facing those challenges united rather than divided, Stephen recognized the profound truth he had spent 15 years denying, that vulnerability, with all its attendant risks, was not weakness, but the deepest form of courage, and that the connection it enabled was worth every moment of potential pain. Outside the hospital windows, dawn began to break over the city, golden light spilling across the horizon. A new day, carrying both the weight of what had been broken and the promise of what might yet be healed between them. Chapter 10. Hearts unveiled, Dawn light filtered through the conservatory glass, painting golden patterns across the thriving plants within. Stephen stood among the orchids his mother had loved, watching as Camilla gently tended to a particularly delicate bloom. 3 weeks had passed since their reunion in the hospital corridor. 3 weeks of careful rebuilding, of choosing trust over fear with each passing day. Eleanor had stabilized, her recovery slow but steady, strengthened by the private medical. Team Stephen had assembled without fanfare or expectation of gratitude. The simple act of support offered without conditions had been the first small step in reconstructing what doubt had shattered between them. "This one's ready," Camilla said, turning toward him with a white orchid cradled in her hands. "Where shall we place it?" Stephen moved closer, close enough to catch the scent of her perfume, mingling with the earthy fragrance of the conservatory. "I was thinking the gallery. The renovation is nearly complete." Her eyes met his, surprise and pleasure mingling in their amber depths. "You visited the gallery?" "Yesterday," he admitted. "I wanted to see it through your eyes this time, not as a business asset." Camilla set the orchid carefully on a nearby table, understanding the significance of this small confession. Since her return to the mansion, Stephen had made a practice of these small vulnerabilities, choices revealed, uncertainties shared. The armor he'd worn for 15 years deliberately set aside piece by piece. "And what did you see?" she asked softly. Stephen reached for her hands, his touch gentle against her soil-streaked fingers. "I saw the place where your parents fell in love, where you learned to paint, where your grandmother preserved a legacy of beauty through decades, of change." He paused, gathering courage for the deeper truth. "I saw the beginning of your story, and I found myself hoping I might be part of its continuation." The simple declaration hung between them, weighted with meaning beyond the unadorned words. Camilla's eyes searched his face, finding only openness where once careful control had reigned. "You already are," she said, the gentle affirmation warming. His chest. From his pocket, Stephen withdrew a small key, offering it with a steadiness that belied the rapid beating of his heart. "There's something I want to show you." Curiosity replaced the question in Camilla's eyes as she accepted the key. "What is this?" "The answer to a question you asked months ago," he replied, leading her from the conservatory through rarely visited corridors of the mansion's 3rd floor. They stopped before the locked door Marcus had mentioned in passing, the studio Stephen had abandoned after his parents' death, sealed away with the artistic passion his father had deemed impractical distraction. "Your studio," Camilla whispered, understanding dawning in her expression. Stephen nodded, the vulnerability of this moment greater than any boardroom negotiation he had ever faced. 15 years untouched. I couldn't bear to enter it after they died. Couldn't face the part of myself that found joy in creation rather than acquisition. Camilla looked from the key to his face, reading the invitation in his eyes. With gentle deliberation, she unlocked the door, pushing it open to reveal a space preserved in time. Easels draped in protective cloths, canvases stacked against walls. Brushes still arranged in jars, as though awaiting their owner's return. "Oh, Stephen," she breathed, stepping inside with reverent care. He followed, heart pounding as 15 years of carefully maintained distance crumbled in the dust motes, dancing through shafts of morning light. "My mother believed I had talent," he said quietly. "My father saw it as childish indulgence." Camilla moved to an easel, carefully lifting the cloth to reveal an unfinished painting, a study of the mansion gardens rendered with surprising sensitivity by the hands of a much younger Stephen Finn. "He was wrong," she said simply, her artist's eye recognizing the genuine talent evident in the brushstrokes. Stephen stepped beside her, his gaze fixed not on his abandoned work, but on her face. The wonder in her expression more precious than any business acquisition he had ever secured. I sealed this room away because it represented vulnerability, he admitted. Creating art means risking failure, exposing your vision to judgment, revealing parts of yourself you can't protect with corporate strategies or financial power. Camilla turned to him, understanding the deeper meaning in his words. Like loving someone. Exactly like loving someone, he agreed softly. Both require surrendering control, embracing uncertainty, choosing potential joy over guaranteed safety. With deliberate care, Stephen reached for a sheet-covered canvas, leaning against the far wall, the last work he had begun before his parents' accident, abandoned in grief and fear. He set it on the easel, hesitating only a moment before removing the protective covering. Camilla's breath caught audibly at the revealed image, an unfinished portrait of his mother in the conservatory, surrounded by the very orchids they had been tending moments earlier. "I'd like to finish it," Stephen said, his voice rough with emotion. "With your help, your guidance." The request represented far more than artistic collaboration. It was an invitation to help heal the wounds that had shaped him, to witness his journey from the man he had been to the man he was choosing to become. Camilla's eyes glistened with unshed tears as she took his hand, her fingers intertwining with his in silent acceptance. "On one condition," she said, her voice gentle but certain. "Name it," he replied immediately. "That you understand this isn't the end of your transformation, it's the beginning." Her free hand touched his chest, resting over his heart. "That walls come down brick by brick, not all at once. That trust rebuilds the same way." Stephen covered her hand with his own, holding it against the steadily beating heart that had once been encased in ice, but now pulsed with undeniable warmth. "I understand," he promised, "and I'm ready for each step, however long the journey takes." In the quiet studio where a younger Stephen had last stood frozen in grief, they sealed this promise not with contracts or corporate guarantees, but with a kiss that spoke of patience and possibility, of forgiveness offered and received, of two hearts finally unveiled after too long behind walls of their own making. Outside, spring sunshine bathed the garden they had planted together, new growth reaching toward the light. Testament to the simple, profound truth that what nurtures with patience and care will, in time, blossom into something beautiful beyond measure.